everyone and welcome back. I'm in a slightly different setting in my classroom because it's in the middle of term time, and I've managed to grab 10 minutes to film a video on just kind of an introduction to genre and genre conventions. So if you're studying the WJC A-level Media Studies specification, then there's a section C, which is all about the Hollywood and Welsh film industry. In order to really understand film, you need to be able to understand genre. Genre is one of the key concepts that we discuss in media studies and actually includes one of the key theories that we need to talk about. And that key theorist is this guy, Steve Neill. Now, Steve Neill stated that genre is simply instances of repetition and difference within media texts. What that means in plain English is that over time, the repetition of certain conventions and certain codes will create a media text for us. And that media text type is called a genre. So we have lots of different genres. We have horror, we have action, adventure, we have comedy, we have romance. And all of these genres have certain expectations attached to them, and they are derived from the repetition of these features that we've seen in the past. However, in order to make a film fresh and original, quite often, some of these features are turned on their heads, hence the idea of repetition and difference. So because my students are looking at the horror pairing of films for A-level media studies, I'm going to be using horror as my example in this video. So how do you actually look at genre and genre conventions? Well, there's many different acronyms out there, but the one I'm going to use today is NICS: narrative, iconography, characters, and setting. So let's start off with the narrative. The narrative structure in horror tends to fall loosely into 3 acts. The first act will focus on building characters, especially the central character, and also introducing the idea of the threat. The second act is building up that idea of the horror or the threat, and the idea that fighting back may be futile or fighting back may have unforeseen consequences. The climax of the film, depending on the ending of course, will usually involve some kind of showdown or some kind of final push to rid the world of this evil. And of course the final twist could involve the possibility of the monster's return. This is a little bonus extra bit that you don't necessarily need to know for A-level, but it's kind of interesting. Noel Carroll, in his essay The Philosophy of Horror, called these 3 stages by certain names. He called them the onset phase, where disorder is created, the discovery phase, where the characters discover something about themselves and through that disorder, or just discover that the disorder's occurred, and then in the third phase, the disruption phase, where the characters hopefully either attempt to or destroy the disorder and then restore normality in some way. These 3 phases do fit a little more with Todorov's theory, and it's possible to map between the 2. So let's now move on to iconography. Iconography in this context refers to media language and refers to our interpretation of those signs and symbols through media language. So let's start off with some audio codes. The soundtrack is particularly important in horror films. It can be slow and eerie and have a slow build-up. Silence is massively important in horror films as well, because it's usually used at the highest points of tension, and then those sudden sharp bursts of music that are used to show certain shocks or jump scares. Whenever you're thinking about these things, you need to think about the actual aims of the genre. The aim of a horror genre is to freak you out. It's to make you feel uncomfortable. It usually plays on fears that we have. And that idea of tension building, usually from something that's unknown, tends to do that quite well. Other things that you might see can include technical codes and the purpose of these technical codes being used as well. So something like the purpose of a close-up. Close-ups aren't generally used a lot in horror films, but if they are, it tends to be more to restrict the view of the audience so that we are put in the position of the protagonist. We know they're going to be scared, so we don't necessarily need to see their face, but what's interesting for us is that we can be restricted in terms of our view of the surroundings and what perhaps could be behind that door or under that table or outside of that window. This is also true of shifting from shallow to deep focus or vice versa. If we can see something moving but aren't sure what it is, that builds tension for us. So having that shift from shallow to deep focus in certain shots can really heighten tension for us as an audience. Other more visual codes can include darkness, can include storms or bad weather, and these of course play on traditional fears. Now let's move on to the scene, which is characters. The evil entity, whether that is a person or a demon or some kind of evil force, will have some kind of trademark, and that's usually where horror films have some kind of difference. They can be embedded in certain folklore, they can be linked to a certain religion. If it's some kind of killer, then they can also have some kind of trademark as to how they kill, but they will also conform to some kind of character archetype of being unfeeling, traditional idea of evil, being stronger than the average human. Again, all of these things playing on our fears. A quick mention as well to representation of gender. So females tend to be portrayed as stereotypically more vulnerable, as the weaker victims, the easier targets, and the males are usually dominant and protective in some way. Now this can be changed. Remember, genre is simply instances of repetition and difference, but that is kind of the traditional representation of females in a straight up horror film. Generally, horror films have quite underdeveloped two-dimensional characters as well. Again, this is very stereotypical, but quite often you can see characters that don't have a huge amount of backstory and characters we don't feel a huge amount for. This is all about balancing emotions for an audience. They may feel so uncomfortable seeing characters they love being killed that the response to that may not be what the industry wants us to feel. We are almost positioned in a distant sort of way. And finally, setting. Of course, we know that there will be some kind of secluded setting, that help will not be available, and that can be done on a grand scale or on a micro scale. It could be something as simple as the phone lines being cut in a house, or it could be a secluded cabin in the middle of the woods. And there will be certain things we expect to see within the mise-en-scène as well. Weapons, quite often, darkness, some kind of communication that will eventually be cut off, things like that. So that's how you can analyse genre, and that's how conventions can be established. When looking at the films for the A-level course, it's worth remembering that hybrid genres do exist as well. So in the case of Drag Me to Hell, which is the film that we're studying at the moment, it's not a straight up horror film. Even though it's marketed as that, you need to be aware of some of the other contextual factors, and I'll talk about that in another video. But if you are interested in that, I would recommend looking up Sam Raimi as an auteur and his defining directorial decisions, because that will give you an indication as to the kind of film that it is intended to be. So that's a really quick video on genre, how to identify certain codes in genres with the example of horror. I hope this was useful to you. If it was, then please give this video a like, and if you want to see more, then send me some suggestions on Twitter, and be sure to subscribe for more media videos in the future. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next one.